Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. George Shultz, appointed by Ronald Reagan in 1982 as our 60th Secretary of State, was a consummate diplomat at the summit of American power, a solver of seemingly intractable national and global problems. Many credit him, along with Reagan, with peacefully ending the Cold War and, for a time, the nuclear arms race with the Russians. Philip Taubman is with us. Philip Taubman is an eminent former New York Times journalist, specializing in national security issues and intelligence policies and operations. He has written a gripping biography of George Shultz entitled In the Nation's Service. The book is a must-read for citizens interested in diplomacy and foreign policy. We're pleased to welcome Philip Taubman to the program to talk about the Shultz legacy.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, congratulations on your book. You worked on it for a decade.
I did, although that was partly because I had to earn a living while I was working on the book, so I had an almost full-time job at Stanford University while I was working on the book.
Now, the titles always intrigued me. In the Nation's Service, you remember when Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton, he talked about Princeton in the Nation's service. George Shultz went to Princeton. Is that what you had in mind when you thought of the title?
Exactly, and you would know as a Princeton graduate, indeed. So it seemed to work perfectly. I think the theme of his life's work was in the nation's service, and it also echoes the Princeton motto.
Now, you may have come across this in your research, but the story was that Shultz had tattooed on his rear end a Princeton tiger. Is there any truth to that? Were you able to verify that?
I think I'm the first person who can verify that.
Did he show it to you?
No, he was very coy about it. You know, whenever asked about it, he would neither confirm nor deny. But I found a letter from the fellow Princeton student that went to New York with him that day. They were trying to enlist in the Canadian military. This is shortly after Pearl Harbor. They got rejected in Shultz's case because of eyesight issues. So what do a couple of Princeton undergraduates do in their disappointment? They had a few drinks, and then they went to a tattoo parlor. And as this friend of his wrote to his father, we had tattoos of a tiger put on our butts.
Well, that's an interesting story. Now, you knew Shultz and you interviewed him for the book. What else did you do?
Well, I met Shultz when I was covering the State Department for the New York Times back in the early years of the Reagan administration. Traveled with him on several overseas trips. Then I moved to the Moscow bureau of the Times, and of course he showed up in Moscow a number of times negotiating various arrangements with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister. So I knew Shultz reasonably well, and then our paths parted. I went on to another decade or two of editing at the Times. He went off to the West Coast, set up shop at Stanford actually, and we were not reunited until about 2008 when I retired from the Times to work on book projects. And at that point he came to me and said, would you be interested in writing my biography? And as an inducement, he said, I'll give you exclusive access to my papers, which are housed at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And in fact, in those papers is a remarkable Cold War document, an 800-page, single-spaced, typed diary that was kept by his executive assistant.
That was Raymond Seitz.
Raymond Seitz for the first 3 years of Shultz's service as Secretary of State. So as soon as I saw that diary, I thought, wow, this is the key to a really inside account of what happened in the Reagan administration. So I went back to Shultz at that point and I said I'd be pleased and happy to write the book. I'm flattered you would ask me, but we got to have an understanding. It's your life, but it's my book. And he immediately agreed. And you know what? Through the course of the time I wrote the book, he saw many chapters before he died. He never asked me to change anything in his favor.
Because it was all true.
It was indeed.
Now, did you actually interview Seitz as well?
Yeah, I spent a day and a half with Raymond up at his retirement home in the woods of New Hampshire. He was very insightful about his former boss, and when combination of talking to him, looking at his diary, and of course many other interviews I did and a vast array of historical materials, you really get a picture of what Shultz did as Secretary of State and how he had to fight to get influence in the Reagan administration. It wasn't obvious at the beginning that the policies that he favored, namely, improving relations with the Soviet Union, were going to be supported by Reagan.
Now, the site's journal, I guess it's a journal,
Yes.
really is the best documentary evidence we have of the relationship between Reagan and Shultz. And having gone through the journal, having interviewed Seitz, having interviewed Shultz, exactly what was their relationship?
Well, it changed over time. When he was appointed in 82, they didn't know each other very well. Shultz had served as an economic advisor during the Reagan presidential campaign in 1980. Reagan actually called him after Reagan was elected to, sort of see if Shultz might be interested in a cabinet job. Shultz had served in 3 cabinet positions in the Nixon administration.
As a matter of fact, other than Elliot Richardson, he's the only person who's held 4 cabinet positions in the United States government.
Exactly. So, they had this kind of inconclusive phone call, and Reagan went ahead and appointed Alexander Haig as Secretary of State.
After the inconclusive
Yes.
phone call.
And Haig flamed out after a year. And so then Reagan brought Shultz in. And the interesting thing is, Shultz came to Washington as Secretary of State actually with the goal of winding down the Cold War. And the most vivid example of that is not long after he gets there, he's invited to dinner at Kay Graham's home, the publisher of the Washington Post. He's seated next to Shultz's wife, Obie. Bob turns to Obie Shultz and says, "What are your husband's goals as Secretary of State?" We're talking about 1982. And she says, without missing a beat, "End the Cold War." So Shultz came to Washington with that notion. What he didn't know was that Reagan had also come to Washington with that notion, but it was obscured behind all of the belligerent rhetoric about the Soviet Union, evil empire. Communism is going to wind up on the ash heap of history. Huge arms build up under Reagan. Underneath all of that, Reagan actually wanted to end the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
That's another example.
Shultz didn't want him to say that, did he?
He didn't. He thought that was too inflammatory. But it took them really the entire remainder of Reagan's first term before they came to understand each other, Shultz and Reagan, and realized that they were actually on the same page.
Well, Shultz, I think, made the statement, I don't make foreign policy. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, makes foreign policy. I just carry it out.
Right. Very modest, maybe a bit of false modesty there.
Team player.
Yeah, but he knew how to develop a trusting relationship with the president.
Now, but within the bureaucracy, he had his strong opponents. He had Cap Weinberger at Defense. And in the early years of his post as Secretary of State, there was the National Security Advisor, William Clark, who was close to Reagan and had a bitter rivalry with Shultz. And that kind of netted, as I read your book, a kind of chaotic, feckless foreign policy where the Reagan administration really couldn't have one voice as to what its approach was to foreign relations.
Yeah, no, exactly. So Shultz ran into this buzzsaw. He comes in as secretary, and believe it or not, and you can see this in the site's journal, months go by, he cannot have a meeting alone with the President of the United States to talk about U.S.-Soviet relations. Every time he goes to the White House hoping to have that meeting, he arrives and the Oval Office or the cabinet room is full of his opponents. And so he actually says to Seitz at one point, this is now many months into his time as Secretary of State, I desperately need a meeting with the president to talk about East-West relations. So it was incredibly chaotic. When you talk to people, as I did, like Jim Baker, who was the White House Chief of Staff, and others who worked in the first term with Reagan, they described it as an anarchy, basically, in the making of foreign policy.
And there was also something of a freeze-out, wasn't there? That I think you recount that Reagan sent a note to Andropov, which he didn't bring Shultz in on, that there were meetings that Shultz wasn't invited to. I mean, there's certainly no way to run a railroad.
No, it was a striking example of how not to conduct foreign policy. You see again, over and over again, not just in the Seitz journal, but in other historical records. I mean, I think the bottom for Shultz, the nadir of his time as Secretary of State, was when he was traveling abroad in July of 1983. And the Defense Department and CIA brought a whole series of decisions before Reagan to escalate U.S. covert intelligence and military policies and operations in Central America without the knowledge of the Secretary of State. Shultz comes back from this trip, and I didn't know this until I read the Seitz journal. He discovers all these decisions had been made by reading my stories in the New York Times. I had managed to learn what had actually happened. He was furious.
So you were more of an insider than Shultz was.
I was on that issue, yeah.
And so you also had his rivalry with Cap Weinberger. Shultz had been Cap Weinberger's boss at Bechtel Corporation, the engineering corporation that had so many ties in the Middle East.
Right.
Now, they worked together well, it seemed, at Bechtel. Why was there such rivalry in the government?
Well, actually, you have to go back to the Nixon administration to see that rivalry. So when Shultz comes in at the beginning of the Nixon administration as Secretary of Labor, Nixon brings Weinberger in to be head of the Federal Trade Commission. Then they create the Office of Management and Budget. Nixon names Shultz as the first director. Guess who his deputy is? Cap Weinberger. Then Shultz ascends to become Treasury Secretary. Weinberger ascends to become Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. So in the Nixon administration, they are rivals, and in each step of the way, Shultz is in the more senior or prestigious position. Then they go to Bechtel. Well, Shultz becomes the essentially chief operating officer, and Weinberger is the general counsel. Again, he's reporting to Shultz directly in this case. So by the time they are joined in Washington in the Reagan
Cain and Abel.
there is a really almost venomous rivalry going on. And it's clearly annoying and frustrating to Shultz that at every turn, Weinberger seems to be opposing him.
Okay, so now Shultz's background was as an economist.
Correct.
He had been in business. Did he have any background at all in foreign relations or diplomacy when he took office as Secretary of State?
Very little, but you know what? The background that he did have, as small as it was critical. As Labor Secretary and then later as Treasury Secretary, he traveled to the Soviet Union. And so therein you see the formation of a different attitude about the Soviet Union than almost anybody in Washington had at that time. Remember, it's the height of the Cold War. He goes to the Soviet Union, and on one of these trips, he goes to Leningrad, and his host is a stony kind of Stalinist minister in the Kremlin. They're on the way up to Leningrad, and Shultz says, I'm hoping we'll go to the Hermitage, right? And this minister says, we will go to the Hermitage, but first we're going to the cemetery.
The Hermitage is a museum.
The museum, one of the world's great art museums. Well, if you've ever been to the cemetery in Leningrad, it's one of the most powerful places to visit. There are tens of thousands of Russians, soldiers and citizens, buried there, died during the 900-day siege of Leningrad in World War II. They're buried in mass graves. It's not like Arlington with the headstones. And as you walk down the path, these mass graves are on either side. So Shultz is walking down the path with this minister, and at a moment he realizes their translator, a Russian woman, has stopped speaking. He turns around. She's weeping, Jim. Then he looks at the minister. The minister is weeping. This has a profound effect on Shultz. He goes up to a terrace overlooking the cemetery. He gives a crisp Marine salute. He'd been a Marine in World War II. And he says, I understand you're honoring your dead. We do the same. And so the takeaway for him at that moment was, yes, there are adversaries. In some ways, there are enemies, but there are also human beings. And he applied that in his dealings with the Kremlin.
So one of his great strengths as a diplomat was his empathy with other people. Maybe you could describe that more fully.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, he established an amazing relationship with Edward Shevardnadze, who replaced Andrei Gromyko, who had been Soviet foreign minister for decades, never cracked a smile. Suddenly, Gorbachev brings in this affable Georgian. At that time, Georgia was a Soviet republic. Shevardnadze is warm. He laughs at himself. And Shultz very quickly figures out that he can build a unique relationship with Shevardnadze. And indeed, he does that. And you can see as you track the rest of the Reagan administration, essentially the second term, in many ways, it's Shultz and Shevardnadze who are conducting the negotiations. Of course, they had to have the approval of Gorbachev and Reagan, conducting the negotiations that bring the Cold War to an end. And the chemistry between them is quite remarkable. When Shultz leaves office, Shevardnadze sends him a note. I found this at the archive at Stanford. And he says to Shultz, we are kindred spirits, quote unquote.
Kindred spirits in their relationship. And so can you really credit that personal relationship with the ending of the Cold War?
I think it played a pivotal role. I mean, yes, you know, there are forces beyond personality, obviously, that are powerful in shaping history, more so in most cases than personality. And there were forces at work here. The Soviet economy was in a stupor. Defense spending by the Kremlin was beyond its capacity to sustain. And Gorbachev wanted to wind down tensions, but he was motivated by a desire to reduce defense spending. But even given that, you can see the chemistry between Shevardnadze and Shultz. When they're talking, the entire record of their negotiations is available. It's all been declassified. And when you read through it, as I did, you see how they worked out problems. Shultz had a wonderful formula that he applied throughout his life as a pragmatic problem solver. And this is the way it went. If you bring people together and they're arguing over principle, they'll never come to an agreement. If you bring the people together and you present the issue to them as a problem to solve, they will actually work together to solve it. And you can see that he and Shevardnadze are working together to solve the problem of the Cold War, just as Reagan and Gorbachev were.
He had a number of other guiding principles. I mean, he believed in strength, even though
he did.
Also believed in negotiation.
He did.
Let us not negotiate from fear, but let us not fear to negotiate.
Right.
Kennedy.
That's the Kennedy line.
Yeah.
But he fully supported the big arms buildup under Reagan.
Yes.
To leverage the Kremlin.
Now, those were his strengths in dealing with other people, and perhaps part of his strength was his ability to deal with and forge a relationship with Reagan when there were all these competing forces in the bureaucracy. But did he have any weaknesses?
He did. I would say probably the most profound was an excess of loyalty. So this is something that was instilled in him during World War II in battles in the South Pacific where he fought as a Marine. And you can see it playing out over the course of his life. So in the Nixon administration, Watergate is now engulfing President Nixon. Shultz, in private conversations with Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Fed at the time, and Burns, by the way, kept a diary. Burns talks about the fact that Shultz realized Nixon was corrupt and that he was immoral and the administration was going down in flames. But he didn't quit. He did not resign until May of '74, 3 months before Nixon did. So that's example one. Example two in the Reagan administration is Reagan comes up with this wild idea of a space-based missile defense, the Strategic Defense Initiative. It's totally unfeasible technologically at the time. Shultz, when he first hears about it, is appalled. He says, this is crazy. The technology will be decades before we can achieve anything like this. And meantime, it's going to upend our nuclear relationship with the Soviet Union. He opposes it. He tries to argue Reagan out of revealing it. Once Reagan gives the national speech announcing it, Shultz salutes and supports it. And then
best case, the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which the press called Star Wars. Could not have successfully defended the United States against nuclear attack.
No, and it couldn't today either.
And it never got there anyway.
No.
So, but it was such a cornerstone of Reagan's foreign policy and attitude toward the Soviets. And then they met at Reykjavik. They, Gorbachev
Right.
and Reagan, Shultz was there, I guess Shevardnadze was there too. And they basically reached an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons, except Gorbachev wanted Reagan to give up Star Wars. Why did he want him to give up Star Wars if it wasn't even effective?
Well,
and Reagan refused to do it, and so the negotiation broke down on that issue.
Yeah, so, I think in retrospect, you look back, that was a hinge point in history. They did agree momentarily at Reykjavik to eliminate all nuclear weapons. And to me, what I never could understand about it, and I asked Shultz about this, is, okay, Reagan is pushing forward with the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. Let's figure he's using it as a bargaining chip with the Kremlin. Okay, fair enough. So now you come together, you've got them where you want them. Gorbachev is saying, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. The only thing you have to do to get my assent to do that is to agree to keep research on Star Wars in the quote unquote laboratory for 10 years. And Reagan says, no, I won't do that.
Well, if he'd been successful in doing away with nuclear weapons, you didn't need Star Wars.
No, but the truth is, had they agreed in Reykjavik, I think Reagan would have come back to Washington. He never would have gotten that through the Congress of the United States.
Yes. Of course, at the end of the day, Gorbachev addressed the UN and hailed the end of the Cold War. And he credited Reagan and his administration and George Shultz with bringing about the end of the Cold War. And Shultz is popularly thought of as the architect of the end of the Cold War, although it seems to me that today the Cold War continues, maybe even worse than it was before in Ukraine. But I have a question for you, Philip Taubman, and the question is, why was George Shultz, if you think so, one of our greatest secretaries of state?
The reason I think you can say that about him was, first of all, the achievement, which is winding down the Cold War. And the way Gorbachev put it for use in my book, this comment that he gave that's in the book is, without Reagan, the Cold War would not have ended, but without Shultz, Reagan would not have ended the Cold War. So it's that singular achievement, I think, that makes him an historically significant figure among U.S. Secretaries of State. But beyond that, if you look at his service as Secretary of State, you see the application of something so rare in Washington, especially today, my God, which is setting aside ideology, setting aside partisanship, concentrating on solving problems. You know, that's really what he came to town to do, and he succeeded.
So his genius was as a problem solver.
I think that the term I would use if I had the opportunity to say in just a few words who George Shultz was, pragmatic problem solver.
Pragmatic problem solver. Philip Taubman, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just wonderful. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best. I'm Jim Zirin.